to the Waterways Speaker Series, brought to you by Riverscape, a nonprofit organization with a focus on the beautification and redevelopment of the Wabash River corridor in Vigo County, in partnership with our friends at Vigo County Public Library. And I just want to say from Riverscape that we are so pleased with Vigo County Public Library's partnership. It has been tremendous. And we are also pleased with the number of people that we have seen at all of these talks. The turnout has been more than we ever expected. And tonight is, of course, the last talk. So we are glad to see some familiar faces and some new faces in the audience. My name is Susan Doley, and this is my third year as board member for Riverscape. Riverscape is excited to be hosting Waterways in West Terre Haute. We are the only all-volunteer organization in Indiana that was chosen for the exhibit, and we could not do it without the support of many local volunteers, some of whom are here tonight, and partners. Waterways is a Smithsonian Institution traveling exhibition that reveals the central nature of water in our lives. With it, we've produced a companion exhibit, Pearls of the Wabash, which explores the local community's history and relationship to the Wabash River. Waterways is made possible by the Museum on Main Street partnership between the Smithsonian and Indiana Humanities. Both exhibits are at the Vigo County School Corporation Administration Building through January 2nd at 501 West Olive Street in West Terre Haute. You just go down to Subway, go west to Subway, and turn left and follow it all the way to the end. It's open Tuesday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from noon to 3 p.m. Tonight marks the 12th and last presentation in the Waterways Speaker Series. All of these talks are being recorded and will be available soon on the library's YouTube channel and linked from Riverscape Terre Haute. That's the name of our YouTube channel. Our speaker series booklet succinctly describes tonight's speaker, Dr. Peter Scott, as a retired professor of biology who taught for 18 years at Indiana State University and a member of the Wabash Valley Audubon Society. I've known Peter for quite a while and can add that he is also an adventurer, an inquisitive learner and researcher, a valued mentor to his students, a bicyclist, and a very good writer. Peter and his wife, Dr. Diana Hughes, who is here in the audience tonight, have opened their home to several international students over the years. Importantly for us tonight, he is also very knowledgeable about birds and enjoys sharing that knowledge. For birds of the Wabash River, eagles, egrets, and warblers, Dr. Scott will talk about the rich variety of bird species found in the Wabash River bottomlands. These include raptors, wading birds, and small migratory land birds. He'll guide us in exploring the history of the bald eagle's nesting habits and population growth, the use of the Wabashiki wetlands by great egrets and blue herons, and the less conspicuous migrations of many warblers along the river. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Scott.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sue. Nice to see a good turnout from the Bicycle Club tonight. All right, let me get back here to number. So Dan Bradley invited me to give this talk a while back, and I appreciated the invitation. And I thought, I have been birding in Vigo County for 25 years now. I ought to be able to say something about birds of the Wabash River. But there's 250 birds that use the Wabash River in the course of the year, so I realized I needed to be selective. So I decided, as Sue said, to talk about bald eagles since they've made such a sensational comeback along the Wabash River, and they're a common sight at Dewey Point. Egrets and herons, which are another classic species that uses wetlands and in summertime can be seen from Dewey Point. And then the warblers. If you're a bird watcher, you know all about warblers, but if you aren't a dyed-in-the-wool bird watcher, this is a sort of a less familiar group that has a less conspicuous migration along the Wabash, but 35 species pass through here every spring and fall. using the Wabash floodplain. So I'm indebted to, this show wouldn't be possible without photographs that have been loaned to me by some great photographers from here in Vigo County. And the two principal ones I'm using are Michael Brown and Jim Sullivan. And you'll see their photographs are pretty good. And several other people have also contributed along with state DNR staff. So again, when I first decided to do this talk, I quickly settled on these three bird groups for the reasons I've just given. But then I thought more about, as I was putting the talk together, what the Wabash River offers these birds. And there, a few general statements sort of came to mind to me. And one is that a river, a real sort of a major river that's not been tamed with dams, creates the landscapes that are hard for us to subdue and to transform. There's winding courses, there's flooding. No matter what you do, the river still sort of keeps coming back at you, and there wind up being little patches of preserved, forgotten woodlands and things like that that are hard to get to, but that the birds find. And so, rivers help us retain semi-wild land. Secondly, rivers supply food for fish, obviously, for fish-eating birds, aerial insects for swallows that nest under the bridges, and indirectly through all the plant life they support. And rivers are also arteries for travel. And the Wabash River is particularly useful, I think, for birds, especially the north-south migrating birds, because it's basically got a north-south orientation throughout much of Indiana, and birds that have migrated up the Mississippi can shift into the Wabash and follow it northward. This isn't as all documented as nicely as I would like to see it, as it might have been, but I'm convinced from my observations that there's just a heck of a lot of traffic along the Wabash River, north and south, by migrating birds. So bald eagles have reestablished their populations along the Wabash. Great blue herons nest in rookeries on tributaries of the Wabash. Great egrets move from the Gulf states northward in the summer, and warblers migrate along it. My talk is based on my experience of the Wabash near Terre Haute. The floodplain woods in Terre Haute, I used to live, Diane and I lived in Farrington Grove for our first dozen years here, and I used to go up to this area, what we call the 4th Avenue Bottoms, to the west of Woodlawn Cemetery. Used to be a somewhat more accessible road in there. I still beat my way in there now and then. And that was before Wabashiki was set up on this side of the river. But again, there were ways to get in there too in the past. And so most of my birding on the Wabash River has been within the city limits of Terre Haute. But also I've come to explore more in southwest Vigo County, down west of Prairieton, Fairbanks Fish and Wildlife area south of there, some woods south of Clinton, along Burriette's Creek, and up to Sugar Creek in Bart County. So let's begin with our national bird, the bald eagle. As you all know, the bald eagles made a great comeback from a terrible decline in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century, and we've been witness in the last 20 years to a remarkable comeback of the bird in Indiana. So I'll go over that using some slides that the state DNR people have kindly loaned me years ago for use in my ecology classes at ISU. And then I'll talk about the importance of the Wabash River to that comeback, and a little bit on the identification of bald and golden eagles. So they're about a dozen or more DNR slides, again, that have been loaned to me by the state ornithologist Allison Gillette and her predecessor John Castrali. So I'm very indebted to them for the data on the bald eagle comeback. This is John Castrali up on the Sycamore building in Terre Haute, photo by Jim Sullivan, of John banding Peregrine Falcon nesting. As you may know, most years of the last 10 or 15, peregrine falcons have nested successfully on the ISU campus for many years, and more recently in a nest box on the Sycamore building. But it's kind of an interesting difference between the peregrine falcon and the bald eagle. There's only one pair of peregrines in Terre Haute, and my colleague Steve Lima says, Terre Haute's only big enough for one pair of peregrine falcons. Whoever has it will chase anybody out. Bald eagles, interestingly, are more tolerant of each other. So John lent me these original slides in blue. And the original status of the bald eagle in Indiana, when American settlers moved in, is not that well documented. But these are the locations here in red are the areas where the DNR has established that there were known nests back in the 19th century. And the last active nest before the current comeback was in 1897. And most of them were most of the known nests were along the Kankakee River back before it was changed, and in tall timber along there. Amos Butler, whose great book summarizes sort of the first 50 years of knowledge by the settlers of birds of Indiana, has this to say about the bald eagle. He's writing in 1898. It was formerly a common resident throughout the state and is still generally distributed in fall, winter, and spring. East and south of the Wabash River, it is not now known to breed. Butler lived in Brookville in eastern Indiana, so he was more on top of the situation over there. And there had been nesting around Brookville, but it had stopped. Its former occurrence led to a number of streams, fords, and lakes receiving the distinctive name eagle. If you think about it, how many of those you run into in Indiana? In Lake County, up on Lake Michigan, it bred quite commonly 40 years ago. So, and it still breeds in limited numbers in the tall trees along the Kankakee River and in Stark County at English Lake. So there are two big phases of eagle decline. One was from settlement for the next century, hunting, persecution, habitat loss. It was a culture of shoot hawks. They get chickens now and then. They maybe get lambs. They're predators. Shoot them. And if you think, it's amazing to think that white-tailed deer were also extirpated in Indiana for 50 years. Wild turkey were too. So there was a lot of hunting and shooting back then, and there was more clearing of land, more clearing of forest than we would think of today. A lot of marginal land was cleared, and so habitat was lost. So before the turn of the century, there were no longer any breeding bald eagles in Indiana, but there were in northern states, in Minnesota and on the Canadian border, and actually in Florida also. But after World War II, with the invention of DDT and other organochlorine pesticides and their application, there was a further precipitous decline where the eagles were still breeding. And it so happened that DDT has an effect. It doesn't break down, and so it applied to crops and all. It gets into the water, it gets into fish. It is picked up by any predators that are eating fish, and then it has this curious effect of thinning the eggshell of birds, especially in birds of prey that concentrate a lot of it, and also in pelicans and herons and things like that. So by the late 60s and 70s, in the 60s, it became quite apparent that there was terrible failure of hatching in bald eagle nests and other things. And this is a story that's complicated and I don't have time to go into. But there was this great decline that was very alarming and led to the banning of DDT in 1973. And after that, there was but before then, here's Mumford and Keller in their great book in 1964 saying bald eagles are still a part of the avifauna of Indiana in fall and winter, but none is nested in the state for 8 decades. But in 1985, after more than 10 years of banning of DDT, there was a relatively quick response of of the eggs being hatchable and eagles being able to raise their young in places like Minnesota and so on. And then the falconers, with their knowledge of how to raise young birds of prey and to release them into the wild, brought their expertise to bear with state fish and wildlife agencies. And states like Indiana all began trying to restore their bald eagle populations. And they found that if you took, the eaglets take about 3 months to mature, but if you take them when they're about 2/3 grown from a nest and bring them to some other part of the country and release them properly or take care of them properly, they may be able to make it. So ours from Indiana were taken from nests in Alaska and Wisconsin. Here's a boat coming out of Admiralty Inlet with eagle in each of those cages, little eaglet, and the ones from Wisconsin were just trucked down here in the back of a pickup. And they were put into a hacking tower on a remote part of Lake Monroe, where they were taken care of for about a month, and they had their little artificial nest and be able to look outside. They're monitored and fed, and then they open up the cages when they're about 12 weeks old, and they're banded in these early years and allowed to fly off. But the idea was that they would stick around in the vicinity of where they fledged, even though they didn't have their parents around. So over a 5-year period, 73 eaglets were brought in for this, and 25 of them survived 5 years, which is a very high number. When if you think of what Brand Fisher was talking about, muscle reintroduction and how tough that was, bald eagles were real champs, were able to do this pretty well. And finally, since an eagle takes 5 years to reach reproductive maturity, it was 1991 before the first successful nest happened. The DNR for over 20 years monitored bald eagles with helicopter surveys at 2 in the spring to check nesting status and 1 in May to measure the success of the nests. And they went up and down the rivers, and fortunately, as far as I know, there were no accidents in that work. Now here's a set of slides showing bald eagles, distribution of bald eagle nests. 1989, we've got 2 nests there near Lake Monroe and on the White River. And they are 5 years later, they've spread out along various forks of the White River. And by 1999, we've got 2 or 3 on the Wabash River. And now we've got a couple in Vigo County and more on the Wabash River 5 years after that. 2010, you can see they like the Wabash River very well as all the forks of the White River. And 2016, they're beginning to repopulate the Kankakee area. And finally, 2017, this is the last slide I have there. Looks to me like there's 13 nests in Vigo County. This shows the number of bald eagle pairs in Indiana up through 2007 only. It's going well beyond that, but this is a classic shape of an exponential growth curve for a population. Nesting success, the DNR had hoped for 60% nest success, but through 2007 it was higher than that, meaning of nests initiated, a successful nest is one that fledged at least 1 young. So that did not diminish over the years. Productivity is the number of young per nest, including failed nests, and they were hoping for 1 eaglet per nest, and they got over this period an average of 1.4. So of nests that were successful, 3 is the most young that eagles have raised in Indiana. Very occasionally there's a report of a 4 eaglet nest, but the most common outcome in Indiana has been 2 young per nest if it's successful. Recently, this past year, there was or a couple of years ago, there was an analysis by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Cornell Lab of Ornithology of the population in the lower 48 states, and the estimate is over 300,000 bald eagles. Now that doesn't include Canada and Alaska. We might well have 1 million bald eagles on the North American continent now. So the reasons for the rebound are, one, the banning of DDT took care of this eggshell thinning problem. And it's not like the bald eagles are living in a pristine environment now. The ecotoxicology journals are still loaded with papers on mercury levels and things like that in eagles and other hawks and so on. But you can't deny that the population is growing, and they're fledging young, and they're living rather long lives. So DDT banning was crucial. The endangered species status was also crucial, giving the protection from shooting and so on. And then, but along with that, more important even than the legal protection, was there was just a change in attitude, change in culture about, you have to look hard to find a person who wants to go shoot a bald eagle these days. And 20 years of hard reintroduction efforts by the state were very important. And then the habitat requirements were present. This is the same as with deer and turkey. They like our present landscape. And their habitat requirements are pretty simple. Give me some big trees to nest in on an undisturbed bend of a river, plenty of fish to feed on, and it doesn't hurt to have some warm water reservoirs in the winter. So the importance of the Wabash and White River have been that they've provided these nest sites, low disturbance, and an abundance of prey fish. Bald eagles build big nests, as you may have noticed. Here's a nest down in southwest Vigo County at True Blood and Sutliff. Have any of you ever seen this nest? A lot of people stop there. If you go by there in the nesting season, this one is only about, I took these pictures the other day, it's 200 yards across a soybean field to this little woods, and you can see the nest in the distance there and then up close here. So that's close enough that people can come along, park on the roadside, watch with binoculars. 200 yards is pretty close. And people, every time I've been there, people have been quite good in their behavior and are really appreciating having a look at them. I think this bald eagle pair ought to get the public outreach award effort for raptors of Vigo County. And Jim Sullivan has taken some amazing photos of these birds down at True Blood and Sutliff, refurbishing their nest each year. And here he's got them young in their sort of chocolate phase. Get a little darker. Now here's a nest that's a little more distant. Can you see the nest? No, you can't. But it's way off in that line of tree. Now, how about now? All right. I zoomed in. So this is what they like. They like to be about a mile from a road. And they've got that in most of their nesting spots in Vigo County. So what the Wabash River provides, first of all, is big trees, sycamores, cottonwoods. These are trees that grow fast and are plentiful along the river, and that's what they like to nest in. They've got a long nest cycle. They lay eggs in January or February. They fledge their young in May or June. So with those big old nests in a big tree, nest activity for 5 months, there's just you can understand how they get wiped out quickly. If you were in a shoot hawk's culture, they're easy prey. Now things are different. There is a fascinating in-nest eagle cam operated on the Notre Dame campus at their environmental center, which for the last 5 years has been taking these pictures. I just found out about this, but you can go just Google Notre Dame Eagle Cam, and you can see highlights now, and then once the eagles come in, you can just see anytime you want to what's going on there. Some fantastic footage of the young hatching out, of turtles being brought into the nest as prey. And this thing has given us our best idea of what eagles are eating or at least bringing their young at these nests from an article published recently on the prey items found in that nest, documented by camera. Fish account for about 3/4 of the food. Birds are taken. They like coots. Mammals, and turtles. Now here's a photo by Jim of, I don't know fish very well, but I assume this is a carp being brought into the nest at True Blood. Big fish anyway. And bald eagles, are often said, they're famous for stealing prey from osprey, which are better fish hunters than they are. But bald eagles can get fish themselves. These are photos taken at Wabashiki by Jim. Bald eagle coming down and getting its prey. In a growing population, since you got 5 years till maturity, immatures may make up the majority of the population. They're not nesting each year. What are they doing? Well, they come to Wabashiki, among other things. Here's about 13 or so active. There's 2 of them are adults with the white heads, and the rest are these brown, dark juveniles, and the water's shrinking, and there's fish in there that are easy prey, and they're all going after them. Here you see a young, a bald eagle. It's probably a year old, got the brown eye. But the adult has got the fish. And the eagles all chase each other around. These are 2 immatures, showing a lot of speckling of white that they have, and their overall brown condition. You can see them looking out from Dewey Point, playing around like this, and occasionally they get chased by ferocious little birds like the eastern kingbird. Okay, finally I want to discuss identification of juvenile and immature bald eagles and golden eagle status, because when you see these brown eagles in midsummer flying around, people get to thinking, are those golden eagles? And golden eagles do occur in Indiana, and so I'll go over briefly their occurrence. Golden eagle's mainly a western bird, but there are populations breeding up in northern Ontario and Quebec and Labrador, and this dotted orange line shows the winter range of the eastern population. And they are relatively rare, but they do occur. And I've seen them. If I want to see them in winter, I go up to Park County and ask Alan Bruner to come out with me and knock around. And in a day, we might see 1 or 2, and we'll see 50 bald eagles. But a golden eagle flies with its wings tilted upward a little bit like a turkey vulture. They too have a period when they're young, the first 4 years, of having a lot of white on them. But notice that the white is more concentrated in distinct patches on the underside of the wings and in the rump. Whereas the bald eagle, it's more spread out, more blotchy. And the bald eagle also doesn't often tilt its wings up like that. It flies more flat. But it is tough at a distance. You need a good look, and I've been fooled quite a few times. Interestingly, in the old days, Amos Butler writes that the first year they are black and are known as the black eagle and also the Washington eagle. So that's not a name, we don't use that name anymore, but it's kind of neat that they distinguished it with a different name in the old days. So there's an immature bald eagle, and there's an immature golden. Okay. So basically what the Wabash offers bald eagles is nest trees with little disturbance, room for population expansion, fish prey near their nest sites, and the flooding leading to drying ponds in the summer has a lot of stranded carp, so good food supply. And in the winter, you'll see them up along by the Duke Energy plant and by the Cayuga one further north. And so that helps them stick around in winter. All right, my second group of birds is egrets and herons. This will be a little briefer than the bald eagle thing, and then the warbler will be long again, so I think I'll make it within the hour. I got a call from Ruth Erickson, who's here in the audience, about 15 years ago. One night, I left a phone message. She says, "Peter, there are hundreds of egrets out at, we didn't call it Dewey Point then, out by Ramsey's Tavern." And so I drove out to Ramsey's Tavern on the little viewpoint there, and she was right. They weren't on the ground like this. They were draped in the trees. It was like a scene from Florida. And as I recall, there were at least 100. It was, midsummer. And what had happened was, what happens sort of annually is that these great egrets, which breed in the Gulf states, as I'll show you a map in a minute, had come up to forage for a few months and find good fishing habitats, and they'd settled in up here in our flooded wetlands. And any of you who live in West Terre Haute know how the water level fluctuates and how there are periods in the summer when the waters are going down, there's a lot of stranded fish, and the herons and egrets are quick to figure this out. Now in this picture, how many heron egret species do you see?
3.
3, very good. You must have spotted the little one down here, which is a snowy egret. But see how much smaller it is than the great egret. And they are much less common coming north, but a few of them come up. And then the great blue heron, which is our year-round resident heron, although much less common in the winter. So, but it's the great egrets that really steal the show for their conspicuousness. This is the map of their main breeding range. A few nest in Indiana. You'll find a few, some have been spotted in great blue heron rookeries, but for the most part, the breeding birds breed down there. But when they're finished breeding in summer, they're free to migrate, and young birds, 2 or 3 years old before they breed, may travel up much earlier. Usually we have great egrets up here by April. But they are moving up the Mississippi Valley into Indiana as sort of summer feeders. They, in breeding plumage, they have fine frilled feathers, and you do see some birds in Indiana with plumage like that, but most of them apparently don't breed here. They are well adapted for catching fish. There's a little sequence by Jim. And our other long-legged bird is great blue heron, about the same size, and also a fish eater. But they have a breeding range that goes further north. They breed throughout Indiana, and some of them winter here, but most of them move south. I once saw a great blue heron on an icy winter floating down past Fairbanks Park, standing on a sheet of ice. So they can handle it. They get on their nests very early in March, and you can see them before the leaves have come out. They nest in rookeries on undisturbed tributaries. In fact, I remember a kayak trip I did with Hans Mann and others years ago, going down Deer Creek, where we traveled underneath one of these rookeries, and they were chattering away, and it must have been 30 or 40 nesting birds. And here's a picture that Jim Sullivan took out at Brazil Sewage Lagoons near there in Clay County. So this is how they like to nest, up in a sycamore tree often. And there are probably 5 or 10 of these rookeries in Vigo County. They won't nest right on the Wabash River typically, but they'll nest in the tributaries, Otter Creek, Honey Creek, places like that. Give them half a mile of undisturbed creek, half a mile between roads crossing it, and you might have a great blue heron rookery. It's interesting that herons, some are white, some are dark. Quite a difference in these. And there's 2 things to think about there in terms of the advantage of dark and light plumage that have been studied by ornithologists. The perspectives of the prey and the predators and the competitors. A white bird, which is very conspicuous to us looking out from, say, Dewey Point, you see it much better than you do a great blue heron. From the point of view of a fish in a well-lit, sunlit environment, may be much less conspicuous. And there's plenty of data to show that a darker bird does better in more shaded tributaries and stuff than in an open, sunlit environment. Also, there's one heron species that comes north in smaller numbers than the great egret called the little blue heron, in which the adult is dark and the juvenile is white. And it tends to forage with snowy egrets, a somewhat larger species, and is tolerated. And so it could be an extra complication that a white plumage allows them to mingle with another species and forage without being chased away. There are other smaller herons in the Wabashiki, notably the green heron, which becomes kind of conspicuous in late summer. They nest out there in the buttonbush and the willow thickets. Black-crowned night heron, Dan Weber and I used to go out there in the summer on mosquito-infested nights and wait till dusk when these night herons would come flying out right over what we now call Dewey Point. So there's always seemed to be a few nesting pair of them out there. At least I hope they still are. So what does the river offer egrets and herons? Again, rookery sites, big sycamore trees are important for the great blue heron. Plenty of fish. For the non-breeding great egrets, flooded wetlands with fish available. Pretty simple story. Okay, part 3, warblers. Serious birding. I'm going to address what warblers are, their long-distance migrations, their identification challenges, the legacy of a great Terre Haute birder named Eugene Munch, the migration corridor near Terre Haute, and the Wabash River levee trail. Warblers are insect-eating birds with slender bills. They glean insects from the foliage of trees and shrubs, typically. This is a prothonotary warbler with some kind of insect in its bill. One of Jim's shots. Being insect eaters, these warblers need to winter in warmer climates. Most of them go well into the tropics of America, and although a few of them winter in the southern United States. For example, here's a magnolia warbler, which breeds north of us in blue up in Canada for the most part, and winters down in Mexico and the West Indies, a common distribution of warblers, but there are others. So they have a long distance to migrate, hundreds, thousands of miles in some cases, north in spring, south in fall, and they've been called, the jargon for them in conservation language, in conservation circles in the last 20 years has been neotropical migrants, migrating to the neotropics, i.e. the New World tropics, but migrating between New World tropics and the New World temperate zone. Here's a different, a somewhat different distribution. The bay-breasted warbler, which passes through Terre Haute every year, breeds up in Canada like the magnolia, but winters down in northern South America. Some of these are migrating across the Gulf of Mexico to get to the United States. Others are coming around the Gulf. Some in the fall migrate from Canada out over the Atlantic, taking 3 or 4 days to get to South America. There's a great new book by Scott Wiedensall called A World on the Wing, about bird migration that details a lot of this stuff. Typically in warbler species, the male is more colorful than the female. So as a bird watcher, you've got to learn 2 plumages. And warbler identification is not easy. There are 35 species that occur in Indiana. This is the plate from David Sibley's wonderful field guide, and admittedly he's made it difficult by using the first winter female plumage for each of these species. The adult males would be more distinctive, but especially in fall, this is mainly what you're up against if you're trying to identify them. So it takes time. You need binoculars for sure. You need a field guide. You need to study it hard. You need patience. You need to get out early in the morning. You need to know the migration schedule. You need to learn the songs. It takes weeks, years, and I'm still learning. But the Wabash River provides a nice ribbon of habitat for these north-south migrants especially, and also for some that stay and breed. And I like to think of it as a ribbon of habitat that's going in the right direction. North-south, these birds that are going up to breed in Canada and so on. Again, my documentation of this is that I can go to the Wabash River, and the warblers are passing through the whole landscape, and we get them out in Nevins Township where Diane and I live, and anywhere you might go, you could see warblers in migration. But I always see more species when I come down to the Wabashiki and bird there in the morning. Usually 2 or 3 times as many. There's just more movement along the river. Now, there are, I figure, since the 1950s or so, there have been, at any given point in time, 20, 30, 40, 50 people in Terre Haute who know how to identify warblers. And they're pretty good at it, and make a point of getting out each spring and fall for a few days if they're working people, or several days if they're retired, and making sure they see warblers, because it's exciting. But there was one person who devoted considerably more time to it than most of us have, and that was Eugene Munch, shown here on the far right, in a field trip of the Wabash Valley Audubon Society. And Gene his stomping grounds for warblers was the 4th Avenue bottoms. He lived north of ISU and pretty close, within walking distance of this place. And soon after I came to Terre Haute in 1995, he took me on his standard route, which was go around Woodlawn Cemetery. The sign is still there, even though 4th Avenue is no longer continuous on that side of the cemetery. He would walk down in there, and he had a route following an old road that went down to the Wabash. And you can see this is about a mile east-west here, and more than that north-south. And he had various routes he would follow, but typically he'd walk in here. Let's see, baseball stadium's here somewhere. Yeah, there's baseball stadium. Walk in here, come down here, walk up like this. He had a few spots, sort of a magic willow thicket and some mulberry trees along the river. And it's been about 2.5 hours, and he walked back to his home. And I went in there just a few days ago to see what it was like, and the road, the once open road that we walked in there on, ISU used to own this property. They sold it to Indiana American Water, which is good because they want to keep the watershed there undisturbed, and so it's probably pretty good for the habitat. But the road and trail has been overgrown. This is all this bush honeysuckle. You have to beat through it, walk over a few mattresses and things. But eventually you get through, and here's the habitat. Still got green ash growing down in there, silver maples, hackberries, and so on. And these are wintertime pictures, so it doesn't look all that productive. But that was Gene's route. Now Gene, at least for a period of about 15 years, kept lists of what he was seeing, and he kept them in pencil on a little sheet of paper. This is a 5-inch by 4-inch sheet. And we knew that he was doing this, and that he had a good record. He was very knowledgeable on what warblers were passing through, and he especially liked warblers, so he kept track of everything else. And we were always saying, Gene, why don't you write this up? And he said, maybe. But not long before he died, he came up one day to the John Whitaker's lab at ISU and had a shoebox full of his papers of his notes of these birdwatching tracks, and he brought them to Dale Sparks, who was a graduate student in the department at the time, and said, here, maybe you can do something with these. And not long after that, Dale brought him down to my lab, knowing that I was a little more bird obsessed than John Whitaker, and said, you need to have these. So I took a look at them, and neatly organized year by year were these little pieces of paper like this. And this is 4 different days here, 26, 4, 90, with his list of species, sort of abbreviations: Prothonotary Warbler, Tennessee Warbler 1, keeping track of numbers. I said, well, this is pretty good. He's not just a list of what he saw, but he's got numbers. We've got abundances. So I said, I found a graduate student who was hanging out in my lab at the time who had good eyesight, and she could work on these and transcribe these into a digital spreadsheet. And after she worked away for about a month, she had it done, and I proofed it, and we began to analyze it. We have still not gotten very far on it, but it's just a treasure trove of data. And here's his effort over 16 years, steady, from 1985 to 2000. Black is spring dates, and fall is fall dates, and gray is fall dates. So these are the number of survey dates. You can see there's one year where 100 days out of 365, he was down there in the 4th Avenue bottoms checking bird migration. And overall, this amounts to 800 days, at least 2,000 hours, because I know it took 2.5 hours or so each time of observations. And maybe before I pass on, I will get this published. I've got this idea for a manuscript that would be The Legacy of Eugene Munch, Warbler Migration Along the Wabash River in Terre Haute. It got a title, that's a start. So anyway, among the stuff you can get out of that is relative abundance. He saw 33 species of the 35 that passed through over the years. 12 of these were much more abundant than the others. Number one was a rather inconspicuous bird, or dull-colored bird, called the Tennessee Warbler. And his top 12 species were these. If you're bird watchers, that will interest you and not surprise you, probably. For every species, you can make charts using his data of the abundance of the birds on different 10-day periods in spring migration and in fall migration. This is for the yellow rumped warbler, which is the last bird to move out in fall and one of the earlier ones in spring. And you see the adult male in spring plumage and the first fall female in the fall. Now this is a graph of data, not from genes, but from data, Vigo County data from people like me and Dan and others submitting records since Gene's time that have been analyzed that we submit to the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology's eBird database. So you whip out your cell phone, you get the mobile app, you bop, 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 bop. As you see things, it instantly goes into a permanent, internationally available database, as opposed to Gene Munch's penciled things, which is the way I did it for many, many years. Anyway, that program can generate the timing data, and here you see for a group of warblers, not all of them, that you don't see, except for this one species, which sometimes occurs in winter, it's April before you get any of the warbler species, and the majority of them don't show up till May. And then some of them are here through the summer in breeding, and others have gone north to Canada, and we don't see them until they pop up again in August, September. And you can see the timings of these are different for different species, but mainly there's a big push in May and again in September. So I'll go over here a few of the breeding species first. These are birds that need to migrate away in the winter, like the Prothonotary Warbler does, down to the coasts of Yucatan and so on, but comes up and breeds mostly in southern states and is at the northern end of its range in Indiana. It's a pretty nice bird, isn't it? They nest in cavity holes. Here's one that Ben Svengross from Clinton got a photo of at its nest. So they need a swampy woods with a woodpecker hole in there. Now here's the illustration in Mumford and Keller by Bill Zimmerman, showing them a pair at a nest hole. Prothonotary is a rather strange name, but a nice mellifluous one. Does anybody know what prothonotary means?
No way.
I'm looking at the sisters who are here because, as they may well know, the prothonotary is basically the Pope's notary. There is a cleric who is responsible for signing papal bulls and things like that, who wears a yellow cloak. And Spencer Baird of the Smithsonian Institution decided that this warbler was distinctive enough to be in its own genus and came up with this name, Protonotaria, and then Citria, which means lemony, so that sort of doubling the effect there. And so you've got this name, and Mumford and Keller says, well, it really ought to be called golden swamp warbler, but ornithologists and bird watchers have always sort of liked this name of prothonotary or prothonotary, and you can argue about how it's pronounced. Did I mangle that, or is that more or less true about the prothonotary? Anyway, another early arrival is the Louisiana water thrush. And they, again, are a mostly southern species. They show up as early as late March. They're always the ones we're listening for early. Rather dull-colored bird, but they walk. Unlike other warblers, they walk along the water and get insects on rocks.
And pink feet.
Yes, pink feet, right. Very, very bright, almost bubblegum pink. Now here is a bird called the Northern Perula, which if you walk the Wabashiki levee trail in April, May, June, you'll hear this bird call. And I brought along my little bird harassment device, as I call it, which I try to use judiciously. But let's see. There we go. Okay, here's my Bluetooth. Let's see. So this is a bird with a distinctive fast trill that rises up and drops down. You'll hear that. Commonly, these birds share the same habitat with yellow-throated warbler, and this one has a somewhat more distinctive call. Sort of a tripping down the scale call. Rises up at the end. And they really love sycamores, and at one point were called the sycamore warbler. And another lovely thing is the Kentucky warbler, which is very hard to see, but you easily heard in the woods along the Wabash throughout the summer. Now, the majority, though, of warbler species are passage ones that are passing through, going to the north, and not breeding here. An example of one of these is the Tennessee Warbler, which is the most common, passing through here. And I'll play you one more song, because this one we call the sewing machine. And it's very often the only way you would know it's there, because difficult bird to spot. Just a fast-running thing like a sewing machine. Rhythm. The lovely American redstart is one of the more common birds passing through, and this is one, if you're beginning birding, might be the warbler that you first get a look at and say, oh, wow. Golden wing warbler is another beauty. The Cape May warbler, oh, I got to play you this. Is got a very thin, high voice. And this is, you may or may not be able to hear this. Did you hear that? I can barely hear it myself. I got it right up in my ear. Tee, 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 tee. So there are several warblers that are in that range. Cape May warbler, by the way, you might notice its bill is rather sharply pointed, and it drinks a lot of nectar and goes to flowers, and it migrates through right when tulip tree is flowering, and it's a good place to look for them. They're up there high, getting a lot of nectar out of those flowers, competing with carpenter bees for it. Then here's the black pole warbler, which is one of the most common spring warblers in spring passing through, but in fall is very uncommon because it migrates over the Atlantic. And this one has a very thin noise. See if you can hear this. Very, very thin. So, but they can hear each other, I guess. Okay, chestnut-sided warbler, again, showing male and female differences. Actually, this is the first fall female. And again, these are insect-eating birds, finding a lot of caterpillars. The oven bird, which builds sort of a domed nest, and that's the reason for its name. This is an amazing photo by Jim of a magnolia warbler in flight. White tail spots are often mentioned as a field mark. Does the bird have them or does it not? And this is one of those rare cases. You would never see this with the naked eye. It would be too fast. But here he's got it showing all the white spots in that tail. Black-throated green warbler. And then finally by the mid to late May, where the warbler migration is thinning out and we get the latest arrivals. This is a gorgeous bird, the Canada warbler. It's going up to Lake Michigan to breed. Wilson's warbler. And the last one is mourning warbler, which has been coming up from North and South America and will breed up in Michigan and points north. But at this time of year would be down in Darien in Panama. In fall migration, we get the movement back. Fall migration is longer. It's not as it's more spread out. Their birds are not as in much of a hurry, I guess, as they are to get to the breeding grounds, and they're generally in duller plumage than even the males. Eugene Munch had it was a short poem that he had written about. There are days in fall when you're down out watching warblers and leaves are falling at the same time, and you can't tell if it's a bird or if it's a falling leaf. And he wrote a poem on this, and he used to hand it to us, and I don't have it now. I'd love to have it, but it was just sort of a haiku-like poem about fluttering fall feathers and foliage. he liked that time of year. So what does the Wabash River offer warblers? For 8 species, there's breeding habitat, riparian woodland. For 20 plus migratory species, there's resting and foraging habitat that's rich in insect food in both spring and fall. And it's a pathway north and south through Indiana. Now, besides warblers, there are many other neotropical migrants, which I could talk at length about, but I won't, that are passing through that you'd see on the Wabash River: orioles, vireos, tanagers, cuckoos, buntings. All of them are using this artery northward. Where do you see such birds if you want to next spring? Well, the Wabashiki Trail, the part of it that goes along the Wabash River is what I've found to be most productive, and I'll show you another map in a minute. But from south side of Dresser, along that raised levee trail in a narrow little ribbon of forest is a very good spot. And here it is. You drive down there, South Sampson Place, and there's a nice little parking lot now, and there's a sign, Wabashiki Access Parking. And if you walk down the trail, you will watch out for the cross-country team, ISU cross-country team. They're running back and forth. They use it. And It's a great place for migrating birds. It's a forest of silver maple and tulip tree and hackberry. And it's not very wide. It's about 100 yards wide strip on both sides of the levee. But it's something. And here's a view from the interior, looking over west to the Wabash River. So it's a decent strip of woods for the birds to migrate along in. Now, we've got, in the last 20 years, so much has been added to riverine habitat along the Wabash here. And riverscape has been is a big part of that. The DNR Healthy Rivers Initiative has a goal of establishing 43,000 acres of habitat from Sugar Creek down to Sullivan County, and they're over halfway towards that goal. Of course, Wabashiki is preserve that I have very roughly outlined here is a big addition of preserved land, and I've just thrown in the 4th Avenue bottoms over here, which is Indiana American water land, but maybe might become formally preserved at some point. But anyway, it's in good status now. So that's a pretty good stretch there, and this is what you've got, pieces like this here and there along the Wabash. Keith Rubel, in his long career with Vigo County Parks Department, did a great deal to advance this cause, as did many other people, and are many other people. The conservation area south of Clinton, Dan and I spent a fall going in there several times and looking at warbler migration. Here's Clinton, here's the main street going south, the gravel pits, and we were just talking about this area north of Breasted Creek, which is, again, a decent little stretch of riverine habitat. Fairbanks Landing Fish and Wildlife Area down on the Sullivan and Vigo County line is another good chunk. And if we continue this effort and grow more riverine habitat and add to the semi-wild habitat along the Wabash, we can be sure that the bald eagles will appreciate it, and the great egrets will appreciate it, and the warblers will appreciate it, and we ought to have good birding opportunities ourselves for generations to come. So thanks very much for your time.
And if I could say one thing about the library, we're going to be checking out kits next year that are for bird watching. So if you think this is something that you are curious about, it's going to be a manual and binoculars. So hang on and you can try it out before you go to the expense of purchasing equipment. So just a plug for the library there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Peter,
Yes.
what's the average lifespan for these three birds that you talked about tonight?
Those groups, average lifespan.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, first of all, what does a bird that survives the first year typically make it to? Maybe we'll put it that way, because there's a lot of mortality the first year. For bald eagles, I imagine 15 to 20 years is not unusual. For the egrets and herons, I would guess 8 to 12 years. I can look this up and tell you about it. For warblers, there you've got it's generally thought for small birds like that are migrating long distances, that basically about 50% of them die each year once they're adults. So an 8-year-old bird would be unusual. But to reproduce successfully, they've got to go south and come back at least once.
Right.
And maybe 2 or 3 times is typical. Yes, Jean.
Simple question, but sort of related to bald eagle. How long are their nests used?
Well, I think they can be used for a long time. Sometimes a pair will build an alternate nest and move to that for a while and come back to another one. But you only know that for sure if you've got banded birds. And I'll have to look that up. But it seems like I have read that a nest, then the other thing is how long might a given nest be used continuously, and that may not be the same thing as the one pair.
Well, and that's sort of what I meant. I mean, they're so huge and so solid.
Yeah.
Could you go back 10 years later and see the same nest there, or 20 years later?
You could see the same nest. It may not be the same birds.
Right.
We know this with the, probably DNR knows that, and I should ask them, but with peregrine falcons, the turnover on the sycamore building has been remarkable. All those peregrines are typically banded birds, and there's been a great deal of turnover. Sometimes a female will be there for 3 or 4 years, but it'll be a different male each year. So there may be more turnover than we think with the bald eagles too. Yes, Steve?
I look at the birds up. Where are their ears? I mean, most animals have ears.
They do have ears. That's a great question. I wondered that too. But the ears are behind the eyes and they're hidden by feathers. But they have an ear opening there, and apparently the feathers don't diminish the transmission too much. But it's covered.
Can they hear over a long range, like a mile, or I mean, I know their eyesight must be very keen out there. Is their ears? How good or strong are they?
They hear very well. I don't know the figures, but they hear them. I think they hear each other much further than we would hear them.
Well, certainly like big birds, like, owls, of course, are going to be hearing much longer distance.
Yeah. In the back.
Do the herons and the eagles have any natural predators?
Well, the eagles, I think the only predator they would have is that an unguarded eaglet in a nest might be taken by a great horned owl. Herons, a big adult heron is, they're certainly wary of eagles and will fly off if an eagle is around. But they're probably pretty safe once they're at full size.
With the increase in Canadian geese in our area, have they encroached upon any of our migratory birds?
Yeah, I don't know. Canada geese, by the way, were wiped out for a while too in Indiana, believe it or not. But no, I don't think they do.
They all have peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, I mean, a goose, it's our only breeding goose, and it's making a living feeding mostly on vegetation, ripping up grass and things like that. So they aren't competing with ducks particularly for food. And nest sites, they may take over nesting islands that a duck might nest on, but no, I doubt they're affecting other birds. Yes?
Are the wild turkeys here all the time during the year?
Yes, they're permanent resident.
Like you don't see them all the time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. They do vary in their conspicuousness, and especially when the males are displaying in April, May. That's when I see them most. But they're here year round, and they are varying a lot as to whether they're banded up in groups or not. And when they're in flocks, then you'll only see them when you find the flock, and it might be a long distance between flocks. But when they're gobbling, of course, in April and May, you can hear them pretty well. Yes?
Fishing, emulating bird sounds,
Yes.
that's discouraged, correct? Because you're...
Oh, the talking about fishing, just going pss, 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 pss.
Yeah.
You mean like that? I wouldn't discourage it. Because you're usually not doing it for too long at any one point, and it gives you a better look at the bird, and I try it all the time. It only seems to work on song sparrows. But I've seen people who are amazingly good at it. Yeah.
I've done it with a barn owl.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, with, in the spring when we're feeding the young,
Yeah.
the young one will go
Oh, wow.
that. So I went down the trail and did that. And I had Mama come over and offer me a little creature.
Well, I can see why, David. You're good. You're good. I can't do that.
How was it?
It was very, very tasty.
Good. Well, I should let you go. It's been an hour and a half. Thanks very much for your time.